Samuel, a 79-year-old veteran, never imagined that a quiet night at the ATM would thrust him into a life-or-death confrontation. As the rain poured down, he found himself cornered by a young mugger, Jake, whose intentions were anything but innocent. With a weathered hand gripping his wallet, Samuel's mind raced back to his days in the service, where discipline and training became second nature. But as Jake's blade glinted menacingly in the dim light, Samuel's resolve would be tested like never before. What led this troubled young man to commit such a desperate act? And how would Samuel's courage and resourcefulness turn this terrifying encounter into a moment of unexpected transformation? Stay tuned to find out. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if Samuel's story inspires you, don't forget to subscribe. The gentle hum of streetlights filled the air as Samuel Green, a 79-year-old black man, walked down the quiet street. His weathered hands, marked by years of hard work, swung gently at his sides. To anyone passing by, Samuel appeared to be just another elderly gentleman out for an evening stroll. But beneath his unassuming exterior lay a lifetime of experiences that had shaped him into something far more. As Samuel approached the ATM, his mind drifted back to his younger days. Images flashed through his memory: the heat of the jungle, the sound of gunfire, the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He had been a soldier once, decorated for valor in missions that still haunted his dreams. Though he'd hung up his uniform long ago, the discipline and awareness ingrained in him during those years remained sharp as ever. The ATM stood alone, bathed in the harsh glow of a nearby streetlight. Samuel's eyes scanned the area, a habit he'd never managed to shake. The street was deserted, save for a young man loitering nearby. Something about the way the man carried himself set off alarm bells in Samuel's mind. As Samuel inserted his card into the machine, he kept one eye on the reflection in the ATM screen. The young man was moving now, approaching with a purposeful stride. Samuel's muscles tensed imperceptibly, his body preparing for what his mind already knew was coming. "Hey, old-timer," a voice called out, dripping with false friendliness. Samuel turned slowly, coming face to face with the young man he'd noticed earlier. The stranger's lips were curled into a smirk, his eyes glinting with malice. "Evening," Samuel replied calmly, his voice steady and measured. He took in the young man's appearance: mid-20s, unkempt hair, clothes that had seen better days. But it was the glint of metal in the man's hand that truly caught Samuel's attention. The young man, who Samuel would later learn was named Jake, brandished a knife. The blade caught the light as Jake waved it threateningly. "Why don't you just hand over your wallet, Grandpa? No need to make this difficult." Jake's confidence was palpable. He'd clearly done this before, probably multiple times. In his mind, Samuel was just another easy mark, an old man who'd hand over his money without a fuss. But Jake had made a grave miscalculation. Instead of cowering in fear or fumbling for his wallet, Samuel stood his ground. His eyes, sharp and clear, locked onto Jake's. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational. "Son, I want you to think real hard about what you're doing right now." Jake blinked, momentarily thrown off by Samuel's unexpected reaction. He'd been prepared for pleas or frightened compliance, not this unsettling calmness. "What are you talking about, old man? Just give me the money." Samuel took a small step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "Is this really how you want your evening to go? Because I can guarantee you, it's not going to end the way you think it will." For a brief moment, doubt flickered across Jake's face. Something in the old man's demeanor was making him uneasy. But he pushed the feeling aside, tightening his grip on the knife. "Last chance, Gramps. The wallet now." Samuel sighed, a sound tinged with disappointment rather than fear. "I was hoping we could resolve this peacefully." His eyes never left Jake's face as he continued. "But I suppose some lessons have to be learned the hard way." What happened next was so fast, Jake barely had time to register it. One moment, he was holding the knife, feeling in control of the situation. The next, a blur of movement sent a shock of pain through his wrist. The knife clattered to the ground, and before Jake could even think about reaching for it, he found himself spun around, his arm twisted behind his back in an iron grip. "What the?" Jake gasped, struggling against the hold. but it was like trying to bend steel. How could this old man be so strong? Samuel's voice came from behind him, still maddeningly calm. Now, I think it's time we had a real conversation about the choices you're making in life. Jake's mind reeled, unable to process what had just happened. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Old men were supposed to be easy targets, not whatever this was. Fear began to replace his earlier arrogance as he realized just how badly he'd misjudged the situation. "Oh, who are you?" Jake stammered, twisting his head to try and look at Samuel. Samuel loosened his grip slightly, just enough to turn Jake around to face him. The old man's eyes were filled not with anger, but with a mix of determination and, was that pity? "I'm someone who's seen too much violence in this world to stand by and let it happen," Samuel said softly. "And right now, I'm the person who's going to give you a chance to rethink the path you're on." Jake's bravado crumbled entirely. For the first time, he looked at Samuel, really looked at him. He saw the strength in the old man's stance, the steadiness of his hands. This wasn't just some random elderly person. This was someone who had lived a life Jake could barely imagine. I didn't," Jake began, but Samuel cut him off with a gentle shake of his head. "Save it, son. What matters now is what you do next." Samuel's grip remained firm, but there was no malice in it. "You've got a choice to make. Do you want to keep going down this road? Or are you ready to consider a different way?" Jake's eyes darted around, as if looking for an escape. But deep down, he knew he was outmatched. More than that, something about Samuel's words was starting to sink in. I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Samuel nodded, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. "That's a start. Admitting you don't have all the answers is the first step to finding them." As they stood there, the reality of the situation began to settle over Jake. He had come here thinking he'd score an easy target. Instead, he'd encountered someone who had not only bested him physically, but was now challenging him on a level he hadn't expected. "What are you going to do with me?" Jake asked, a tremor in his voice betraying his fear. Samuel considered the question for a moment. "That depends on you," he finally said. "I could call the police right now. Or," Jake tensed, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Or we could talk," Samuel continued. "Really talk. About why you're out here with a knife, trying to rob old men at ATMs. About what brought you to this point, and where you go from here." The offer hung in the air between them. Jake's mind raced, weighing his options. He could try to run, but something told him he wouldn't get far. And even if he did, where would he go? Back to the same life that had led him here? "Why?" Jake finally asked. "Why would you even give me that chance?" Samuel's grip on Jake's arm loosened further, though he remained alert for any sudden movements. "Because I've seen too many young men throw their lives away. Because I believe that everyone deserves a chance to turn things around. And because, son, I think you're better than this." The night air hung heavy with tension as Samuel Green stood beside the ATM, his hand resting gently on Jake's shoulder. The young would-be robber's posture had softened, his earlier aggression replaced by a mix of shame and cautious hope. Their conversation had taken an unexpected turn, opening up the possibility of a different path for Jake. But fate had other plans for this evening. A sudden shout shattered the quiet, causing both Samuel and Jake to snap their heads towards the sound. Barreling down the sidewalk came a mountain of a man, his face contorted with rage. Jake's eyes widened in recognition and fear. "Eddie," he whispered, his voice trembling. Samuel's military instincts kicked into high gear. In a split second, he took in the newcomer's appearance. Easily over 6 feet tall, with bulging muscles straining against a tight t-shirt. This was no ordinary street thug. Eddie moved with the practiced grace of a trained fighter. "What the hell is going on here?" Eddie bellowed, his eyes darting between Jake and Samuel. "I leave you alone for 5 minutes, and I come back to find you chatting with your mark?" Jake stammered, trying to find words to explain the situation, but Eddie wasn't interested in explanations. His focus had zeroed in on Samuel, rage building in his eyes as he realized what must have happened. "You think you can mess with my partner, old man?" Eddie growled, taking a menacing step forward. "I'm going to show you what happens to people who stick their noses where they don't belong." Samuel's mind raced, years of combat experience flooding back in an instant. He quickly assessed Eddie's stance, noting the way the larger man shifted his weight. This wasn't just blind aggression. Eddie had training, probably some form of martial arts or boxing. "Son," Samuel said, his voice calm despite the danger, "I suggest you take a moment to think about your next move. This doesn't have to end badly for anyone." Eddie's response was a humorless laugh. "Oh, it's going to end badly, all right, for you." He cracked his knuckles, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "I'm going to enjoy this." Samuel knew he had to act fast. Eddie had youth and raw power on his side, advantages that could quickly overwhelm even Samuel's considerable skills. He needed to level the playing field. As Eddie took another step forward, Samuel made his move. With a quickness that belied his age, he reached out and grabbed a nearby trash can. In one fluid motion, he tipped it over, sending its contents spilling across the sidewalk between them. The sudden clatter and the obstacle in his path caught Eddie off guard. He stumbled slightly, his eyes instinctively drawn to the mess at his feet. It was only a moment's distraction, but for Samuel, it was all he needed. In the split second that Eddie's attention wavered, Samuel moved. He slipped to the side, positioning himself at an angle that would give him the best advantage against his larger opponent. As Eddie's head snapped back up, rage replacing surprise in his eyes, Samuel was already in motion. What happened next was almost too fast for the gathering onlookers to follow. Samuel's hands moved in a blur, striking out at specific points on Eddie's body. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like random jabs, but each movement was precise, targeted, and devastatingly effective. Eddie's eyes widened in shock as his body betrayed him. His legs buckled, arms suddenly feeling like lead weights. Before he could even process what was happening, he found himself crashing to the ground, his considerable bulk working against him as he fell. Samuel stood over him, barely winded, his stance ready in case Eddie managed to rally. But it was clear the fight had gone out of the larger man. Eddie lay on the ground, gasping, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and disbelief. What did you do to me?" Eddie wheezed, trying and failing to push himself up. Samuel's voice was steady as he replied, "Pressure points, son. The human body is a complex machine. Know the right buttons to push, and even the strongest engine can be shut down." By now, a small crowd had gathered at a safe distance, drawn by the commotion. Whispers rippled through the onlookers as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. An elderly man, someone's grandfather by the looks of him, had just taken down two younger, seemingly more dangerous men without breaking a sweat. "Did you see that?" one spectator murmured to another. "I've never seen anything like it." "Who was that guy?" someone else asked, awe evident in their voice. As the initial shock wore off, phones began to appear in hands, some recording the scene, others undoubtedly calling the authorities. But no one dared to approach closer, the tension in the air still palpable. Samuel, ever aware of his surroundings, noted the growing crowd. He knew he needed to defuse the situation quickly, for everyone's sake. He turned his attention back to Eddie, who was still struggling to regain control of his limbs. "Now then," Samuel said, his tone firm but not unkind, "I think it's time we had a conversation about the choices you've been making. Both of you." He glanced at Jake, who had remained frozen in place throughout the entire confrontation. Jake, snapping out of his stunned silence, moved cautiously towards Eddie. "I'm sorry, man," he said, his voice shaky. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Mr. Green here, he's different. He was trying to help me." Eddie's face contorted, a mix of pain and confusion replacing his earlier rage. "Help you? What are you talking about?" Samuel knelt down beside Eddie, his movements careful and deliberate. "What your friend is trying to say is that sometimes life gives us unexpected opportunities to change course. Tonight was one of those opportunities for Jake. And now it seems for you as well." Eddie's eyes darted between Samuel and Jake, suspicion warring with a grudging curiosity. "Who are you really?" he asked Samuel, his voice a mix of fear and respect. The wail of sirens pierced the night air, growing louder as police cars approached the scene. Samuel Green stood calmly, his weathered hands resting on the shoulders of Jake and Eddie. The two young men, once full of bravado, now looked subdued and uncertain. As the police vehicles screeched to a halt, their flashing lights bathing the area in alternating red and blue, A crowd of onlookers held their breath. The confrontation that had begun as a simple robbery attempt had transformed into something far more complex, and no one was quite sure how it would end. The first officer to emerge from his car was a tall, broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, taking in the unusual tableau before him. As his gaze settled on Samuel, something changed in his expression: recognition, followed by surprise, and then deep respect. The officer straightened his back and, to everyone's amazement, snapped off a crisp salute. "Sergeant Green," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the night. "I didn't expect to see you here, sir." A ripple of whispers swept through the crowd. Sergeant Green? The elderly man they had watched disarm two younger attackers was a military veteran. Samuel returned the salute with a slight nod. "At ease, Officer Johnson. It's just Samuel these days. Retired, remember?" Officer Johnson lowered his hand, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Once a sergeant, always a sergeant in my book, sir. Mind filling me in on what's happened here?" As Samuel began to recount the events of the evening, Jake and Eddie listened in stunned silence. Their eyes darted between Samuel and the officer, disbelief etched on their faces. "Wait," Jake interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. You're a war hero?" Samuel turned to Jake, his expression softening. "I served my country, son. Did my duty like countless others. But that's not what's important right now." Eddie, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly found his voice. But you're just an old man. How did you? He trailed off, unable to reconcile the gentle elderly figure with the skilled fighter who had so easily subdued him. Officer Johnson chuckled. "Boys, you picked the wrong old man to mess with. Sergeant Green here is a legend in these parts. Decorated veteran, hand-to-hand combat expert, and one of the finest men I've ever had the privilege to know." As the reality of their situation sank in, both Jake and Eddie seemed to shrink into themselves. The last vestiges of their tough guy facades crumbled away, replaced by a mixture of shame and regret. Samuel, noting their reactions, gestured for Officer Johnson to give them a moment. He then knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the two young men. "Listen to me, both of you," he said, his voice low and intense. "What you did tonight was wrong. You made choices that could have ruined your lives and hurt others. But here's the thing about choices: you can always make new ones." Jake and Eddie looked up, surprised by the lack of condemnation in Samuel's tone. "Life isn't about the mistakes you've made," Samuel continued. "It's about what you do next. It's never too late to change your path, to choose a different way forward. No matter how lost you might feel right now, there's always a way back to the right road. The question is, are you willing to take that first step?" For a long moment, silence hung in the air. Then, almost imperceptibly, both Jake and Eddie nodded. I wanna," Jake said, his voice barely audible. "But I don't know how." Eddie, his usual bravado completely gone, added, "We've messed up so bad. Who's gonna give us a chance now?" Samuel's face broke into a warm smile. "You'd be surprised, boys. This community, the one you thought was just full of easy targets, it's also full of people who believe in second chances. People who've made their own mistakes and found their way back. People who are willing to help if you're willing to do the work." As if on cue, a voice called out from the crowd. "He's right, you know." All heads turned to see Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman who had recognized Samuel earlier, step forward. "Mr. Green here, he helped my grandson turn his life around. Boy was headed for trouble, but Samuel never gave up on him. Now he's in college, if you can believe it." Her words seemed to break a dam. Suddenly, more voices joined in, people stepping forward to share their own stories of how Samuel had impacted their lives or the community. "Remember when he organized that job fair for at-risk youth? Or the time he talked that young couple out of foreclosure? What about the veteran support group he started?" As the stories flowed, painting a picture of a man who had dedicated his retirement years to quietly making his community better, Jake and Eddie's expressions changed. The shame and regret were still there, but now there was something else too, a glimmer of hope. Samuel, for his part, looked almost embarrassed by the outpouring of praise. He raised his hands, trying to quiet the crowd. Now, let's not get carried away. I'm just one man doing what he can. We all have a part to play in making our community stronger. Officer Johnson, who had been listening with a smile, stepped forward. Well, Sergeant, as much as I'd love to let this turn into a neighborhood appreciation party, we do have some official business to attend to. Samuel nodded, understanding. He turned back to Jake and Eddie. I won't lie to you boys. There are consequences for your actions tonight. But remember what I said, it's what you do next that matters. Use this as a turning point. Show the world, and yourselves, that you're more than your mistakes. As the officers began to handcuff Jake and Eddie, preparing to take them in for processing, something unexpected happened. Eddie, the larger of the two, who had been so full of anger and aggression earlier, looked directly at Samuel. Thank you, he said, his voice gruff but sincere, for not giving up on us, even when we gave you every reason to. Jake nodded in agreement, adding softly, we'll try to do better. I promise. Samuel reached out, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. That's all anyone can ask. Remember, boys, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. You've taken that step tonight. The rest is up to you. As Jake and Eddie were led to the police cars, the crowd began to disperse. But many lingered, their eyes on Samuel, murmuring among themselves about what they had witnessed. Samuel, sensing that his work here was done, began to gather his belongings. He picked up his wallet, the original reason for his visit to the ATM, and tucked it securely into his pocket. Officer Johnson approached him one last time. You know, Sergeant, we could use a statement from you down at the station. Samuel shook his head with a gentle smile. I think you have all you need, officer. Those boys, they're at a crossroads. What they need now is guidance, not punishment. I trust you'll keep that in mind. Johnson nodded, understanding the unspoken request. We'll do right by them, sir. You have my word. With a final nod of respect to the officer, Samuel turned to leave. As he did, a spontaneous round of applause broke out from the remaining onlookers. Calls of "Thank you, Mr. Green," and "You're a hero, Samuel," filled the air. But Samuel didn't stop or turn back. He simply raised a hand in acknowledgement and continued walking, his pace unhurried, his posture as calm and dignified as when he had first arrived. As he moved away from the scene, the noise of the crowd faded, replaced by the quiet sounds of the night. Samuel's mind was already turning to the future, to the work that lay ahead. He knew that Jake and Eddie's journey was just beginning, and he was determined to be there to guide them if they chose to accept his help. The streetlights cast long shadows as Samuel made his way home. To anyone passing by, he might have looked like just another elderly man out for a late-night walk. They would never have guessed that they were seeing a local hero, a man who had just changed the course of 2 young lives and reminded an entire community of the power of compassion and second chances. As he reached his modest home, Samuel paused for a moment on the porch. He looked back in the direction he had come, his thoughts with Jake and Eddie. He hoped that tonight would indeed be a turning point for them, that they would find the strength to choose a different path. With a small sigh, Samuel entered his house, closing the door quietly behind him. The events of the night had been unexpected and intense, but he felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't experienced in years. It was a reminder that retirement didn't mean the end of making a difference. It just meant finding new ways to serve, new battles to fight, not with fists or weapons, but with wisdom, compassion, and an unwavering belief in the potential for change. As he settled into his favorite chair, Samuel's eyes fell on an old photograph on the mantelpiece. It showed a much younger version of himself in military uniform, surrounded by his fellow soldiers. He smiled at the memory, thinking about how the lessons he had learned in service continued to shape his life and the lives of those around him. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the passage of time. But for Samuel, it felt like a new chapter was just beginning. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. And he was ready for them all. As sleep began to overtake him, Samuel's last thoughts were of Jake and Eddie. He said a silent prayer for them, hoping that they would find the strength to embrace the second chance they had been given. And he made a mental note to visit the community center early the next day. There was work to be done, lives to be changed, hope to be nurtured. For Samuel Green, retired sergeant and unexpected hero, the mission continued, and he wouldn't have it any other way. Outside, the night settled into a peaceful quiet. The drama that had unfolded earlier was now just a memory, but its impact would ripple through the community for days, weeks, and perhaps even years to come. All because one man, on one ordinary night, chose to see beyond the surface and offer the possibility of redemption. In homes across the neighborhood, people recounted the events they had witnessed, marveling at the courage and compassion of the unassuming elderly man they had long known as simply Mr. Green. Parents told their children about the importance of second chances and the power of kindness. Neighbors reached out to each other, inspired to strengthen their community bonds. And in a holding cell across town, two young men sat in contemplative silence, their lives forever changed by an encounter they had never seen coming. The seeds of transformation had been planted, and only time would tell how they would grow. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the neighborhood slowly came to life. People went about their morning routines, heading to work, school, or their daily errands. But there was a subtle difference in the air, a sense of renewed purpose and community spirit. And in a modest house on a quiet street, Samuel Green rose to face the new day, ready to continue his lifelong mission of making the world a little bit better, one small act of kindness at a time. The story of that night would be told and retold, growing with each iteration. But at its heart, it would always be a testament to the enduring power of compassion, the potential for change, and the impact that one person can have when they choose to stand up for what's right. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its warm light over the neighborhood, life went on. But it went on with a renewed sense of hope, a stronger sense of community, and a deeper appreciation for the quiet heroes who walk among us every day. And somewhere in the city, in a community center or a courtroom, in a classroom or a counseling session, the ripples of that night's events continued to spread, touching lives in ways that even Samuel couldn't have predicted. The mission, it seemed, was far from over. And Samuel Green, retired soldier and unexpected mentor, was ready for whatever challenges the new day might bring. The morning sun cast long shadows across the community center's worn linoleum floor as Samuel Green pushed open the heavy double doors. The scent of coffee and the low murmur of voices greeted him, a familiar comfort that brought a smile to his weathered face. It had been 3 months since that fateful night at the ATM, and the world had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Samuel's eyes swept the room, taking in the diverse group gathered for the weekly support meeting. In the corner, Jake sat hunched over a steaming cup, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The young man's presence was a testament to the power of second chances, and Samuel felt a swell of pride as he remembered Jake's first tentative steps into the center just weeks ago. "Morning, everyone," Samuel called out, his voice carrying the warmth and authority that had become his trademark. Heads turned, and a chorus of greetings rose to meet him. As he made his way to the front of the room, Samuel couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them all here. The days following the incident had been a whirlwind of activity. News of Samuel's confrontation with Jake and Eddie had spread through the community like wildfire, igniting a spark of hope and inspiring others to take action. The local paper had run a front-page story titled, "Retired Sergeant Turns Street in a Classroom," complete with a photo of Samuel standing tall outside the community center. At first, the attention had made Samuel uncomfortable. He had never sought the limelight, preferring to work quietly behind the scenes. But as more and more people reached out, sharing their own stories of struggle and redemption, he realized that his actions that night had tapped into something deeper, a hunger for connection and a belief in the possibility of change. The community center, once a neglected building on the verge of closure, had become the heart of a grassroots movement. Volunteers poured in, offering their time and skills to run programs ranging from job training to addiction support. Samuel found himself at the center of it all, his military experience and natural leadership abilities making him the perfect guide for this newfound energy. As Samuel took his place at the front of the room, his eyes fell on a familiar face in the back row. Eddie, the larger of the two would-be robbers from that night, sat with his massive frame squeezed into one of the plastic chairs. His presence was still a source of tension for some in the group, but Samuel had insisted on giving him the same chance at redemption as Jake. "Before we get started," Samuel began, his voice cutting through the chatter, "I want to thank you all for being here. Every one of you. By showing up today, is proving that change is possible, that it's never too late to choose a different path. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Samuel could see the mix of emotions on the faces before him. Hope, uncertainty, determination. He knew that for many, this journey was just beginning, and the road ahead would be far from easy. Now, I'd like to invite Jake to share his update with the group, Samuel continued, gesturing towards the young man in the corner. Jake stood slowly, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. Hey everyone, he started, his voice barely above a whisper. So, I've been clean for 2 months now, and I started my GED classes last week. A round of applause broke out, genuine and supportive. Jake's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and pride. Samuel nodded encouragingly, silently urging him to continue. I never thought I'd be doing this, you know? Jake went on, his voice growing stronger. Before that night with Mr. Green, I thought my life was pretty much over. But now, I don't know. It's like I can see a future for myself. And it's all thanks to this group, and especially to you, Mr. Green. As Jake sat down, visibly relieved to have finished speaking, Samuel felt a lump form in his throat. He had seen countless young men and women transform during his military career, but this was different. This was about rebuilding lives that had nearly been lost, about finding hope in the darkest of places. The meeting continued, with others sharing their stories of struggle and triumph. Samuel listened intently, offering words of encouragement and practical advice where needed. As the session wound down, he couldn't help but notice Eddie shifting uncomfortably in his seat, clearly wrestling with whether to speak up. Eddie, Samuel called out gently, is there something you'd like to share with the group? All eyes turned to the back of the room. Eddie cleared his throat, his usual bravado noticeably absent. I got a job, he said, the words coming out in a rush. It's just construction work, nothing fancy. But it's honest work, you know? The room fell silent for a moment, processing this unexpected news. Then, slowly, a smattering of applause began, growing in volume until it filled the room. Eddie's face, usually set in a scowl, broke into a tentative smile. As the meeting came to a close and people began to file out, Samuel made his way over to Eddie. The big man stood awkwardly, towering over Samuel but somehow seeming smaller, more vulnerable. I'm proud of you, son, Samuel said, placing a hand on Eddie's arm. Taking that first step is often the hardest part. Eddie nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. I keep thinking about that night, he said quietly. How different things could have gone. I was so angry, so sure that the world owed me something. But you showed me a different way. Samuel smiled, a mix of sadness and hope in his eyes. The world doesn't owe us anything, Eddie. But we owe it to ourselves to be the best versions of ourselves we can be. You're on that path now. The rest is up to you. As Eddie lumbered out of the room, Samuel felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Officer Johnson standing behind him, a grin spreading across his face. Sergeant Green, Johnson said, snapping off a playful salute. I hope I'm not interrupting. Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. At ease, officer. And how many times do I have to tell you to call me Samuel? Johnson's grin widened. At least once more, Sergeant. Always once more. The two men made their way outside, the late morning sun warming their faces. The community center's parking lot was alive with activity, people chatting in small groups, sharing stories and offering support. I've got to hand it to you, Samuel, Johnson said, his tone becoming serious. What you've done here, it's making a real difference. We've seen a 15% drop in petty crime in the neighborhood since you started this program. Samuel raised an eyebrow. Is that why you're here? To share crime statistics? Johnson laughed, shaking his head. No. Actually, I'm here because the chief wants to meet with you. He's been hearing about your work, and, well, he has a proposition for you. Samuel's interest was piqued. A proposition? What kind of proposition? He wants to expand your program, Johnson explained, excitement creeping into his voice. Set up similar centers in other neighborhoods. He thinks you could train other veterans to do what you're doing here. Samuel fell silent, his mind racing with the possibilities. He had never imagined his small act of compassion that night would lead to something like this. The thought of helping other communities, of giving more people the chance at redemption, it was almost overwhelming. "I'll need to think about it," Samuel said finally. "This isn't just about me. It's about the people here, the community we've built." Johnson nodded understanding. "Oh, why? Of course. The chief just wants to hear your thoughts. No pressure, I promise." As Officer Johnson headed back to his patrol car, Samuel found himself lost in thought. The idea of expanding the program was exciting, but it also filled him with a sense of trepidation. He had always believed in the power of personal connection, of being there in the trenches with those he was trying to help. Could that same spirit be maintained on a larger scale? His contemplation was interrupted by the sound of rapid footsteps approaching. Samuel turned to see Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman who had spoken up for him that night at the ATM, hurrying towards him as fast as her cane would allow. "Mr. Green? Oh, Mr. Green," she called out, slightly out of breath. "I hoped I'd catch you here." Samuel smiled warmly, taking her arm to steady her. "Mrs. Thompson, what a pleasant surprise. What brings you to the center today?" The old woman's eyes sparkled with excitement. "I've got news about my grandson, Tommy. You remember Tommy, don't you? The one you helped get into college." Samuel nodded, recalling the troubled young man who had seemed destined for a life on the streets before turning things around. "Of course, I remember Tommy. How is he doing?" Mrs. Thompson beamed with pride. "He's been accepted into a summer internship program at the mayor's office. Can you believe it? My Tommy, working in City Hall." Samuel's heart swelled with joy. This was why he did what he did, to see lives transformed, to watch as people discovered their own potential. "That's wonderful news, Mrs. Thompson. Tommy has worked hard for this opportunity." As Mrs. Thompson continued to gush about her grandson's achievements, Samuel's mind drifted back to the chief's proposition. Perhaps this was a sign, a reminder that the work he had started here could have far-reaching effects beyond what he could see or imagine. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Samuel met with local business owners who were interested in offering job placements to program participants, counseled a young couple struggling with addiction, and even found time to help Jake with his GED homework. By the time evening rolled around, he was exhausted but filled with a deep sense of satisfaction. As he locked up the community center, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Samuel noticed a familiar figure leaning against a car in the parking lot. It was Eddie, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the asphalt. "Eddie," Samuel called out, approaching the young man. "Is everything all right?" Eddie straightened up, a mix of emotions playing across his face. "Mr. Green, I need to talk to you. About something important." Samuel nodded, gesturing to a nearby bench. As they sat down, he could feel the tension radiating from Eddie. Whatever was on his mind, it was clearly weighing heavily on him. "I've been offered a job," Eddie began, his voice low and uncertain. "A good job, with benefits and everything. But it's not here. It's in another state." Samuel listened intently, understanding the dilemma Eddie was facing. "That sounds like a great opportunity, Eddie. But I sense there's more to it than that." Eddie nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I'm scared, Mr. Green. Scared of leaving, of starting over somewhere new. But I'm also scared of staying, of falling back in old habits. I don't know what to do." Samuel sat back, considering his words carefully. He knew that his response could have a profound impact on Eddie's future. "Eddie, do you remember what I told you that night at the ATM? About choices?" Eddie nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You said it's never too late to change your path." "Exactly," Samuel continued. "And sometimes, changing your path means taking a leap into the unknown. It's okay to be scared, Eddie. Fear is a natural part of growth. But don't let that fear hold you back from embracing new opportunities." Eddie looked at Samuel, his eyes searching for reassurance. "But what if I mess up? What if I can't do it on my own?" Samuel placed a hand on Eddie's shoulder, his touch firm and comforting. "You won't be on your own, son. The lessons you've learned here, the strength you've discovered within yourself, those will go with you wherever you are. And remember, you're always just a phone call away if you need support." As they continued to talk, working through Eddie's fears and hopes for the future, Samuel felt a renewed sense of purpose washing over him. This was what it was all about, not just keeping people out of trouble, but empowering them to build better lives for themselves. By the time they parted ways, Eddie had made his decision. He would take the job, face his fears, and embrace the chance at a fresh start. As Samuel watched him drive away, he felt a mixture of pride and melancholy. It was always bittersweet to see someone move on, but he knew it was a necessary part of the journey. Walking home in the gathering twilight, Samuel's mind returned to the chief's proposition. The idea of expanding the program, of reaching more communities and changing more lives, was beginning to take root in his imagination. He realized that while his personal touch had been crucial in getting things started, the true power of what they had built lay in the community itself. In people like Jake and Eddie, Mrs. Thompson and her grandson Tommy, all supporting and inspiring each other. As he reached his front porch, Samuel made a decision. He would meet with the chief, hear him out, and see if there was a way to grow the program without losing its heart. It wouldn't be easy, but then again, nothing worthwhile ever was. Inside his modest home, Samuel settled into his favorite armchair, his body weary, but his spirit invigorated. His eyes fell on the old photograph on the mantelpiece, the one of him in his military uniform surrounded by his fellow soldiers. He smiled, thinking about how his mission had evolved over the years, from protecting his country on foreign soil to nurturing hope on the streets of his own neighborhood. As he drifted off to sleep, Samuel's mind was filled with visions of the future, of more community centers opening their doors, of more lives being transformed, of a ripple effect spreading outward, touching countless lives in ways he could only imagine. The next morning dawned bright and clear, full of promise. Samuel rose early, his mind already racing with ideas for the meeting with the police chief. As he made his way to the community center, he couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in the neighborhood. The freshly painted storefronts, the absence of loiterers on street corners, the general air of renewal that seemed to permeate the area. At the center, he found Jake waiting for him, a look of nervous excitement on his face. "Mr. Green," he said, practically bouncing on his toes, "I did it. I passed my first GED practice test." Samuel's face broke into a wide grin. "Jake, that's fantastic news. I knew you had it in you." As they celebrated Jake's achievement, more people began to filter into the center. Samuel noticed a new face among them, a young woman, probably in her early 20s, her eyes darting around nervously as if unsure she belonged. Excusing himself from Jake, Samuel approached the newcomer. "Welcome to the center," he said warmly. "I'm Samuel Green. Is this your first time here?" The young woman nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Lisa. I heard about this place from a friend. Said it might be able to help me get my life together." Samuel smiled encouragingly. "Well, Lisa, you've taken the first step just by coming here. Why don't you join us for our morning meeting? No pressure to share. Just listen and see if this feels like a place where you can find support." As the meeting got underway, Samuel couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. The room was filled with people from all walks of life, each with their own story, their own struggles, but all united in their desire for change. He listened as Jake proudly announced his GED progress to the group, watched as Eddie shared his decision to take the out-of-state job, and noticed Lisa gradually relaxing as she realized she wasn't alone in her struggles. After the meeting, as people mingled and chatted, Samuel's phone buzzed with a text from Officer Johnson. The chief was ready to meet whenever Samuel was available. Taking a deep breath, Samuel replied, suggesting they meet that afternoon. The rest of the morning flew by in a whirlwind of activity. Samuel counseled Lisa, helping her navigate the process of enrolling in a local job training program. He mediated a conflict between two program participants, turning it into a lesson on conflict resolution. And he even found time to help Mrs. Thompson set up a video call with her grandson Tommy, watching with pride as she gushed over his internship at City Hall. As the appointed time for his meeting with the chief approached, Samuel felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. He knew that this could be a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire community initiative he had built. The police station was a hive of activity when Samuel arrived. Officer Johnson met him at the front desk, grinning broadly. "Ready to change the world, Sergeant?" Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. "One step at a time, Johnson. One step at a time." The chief's office was spacious but spartanly furnished, dominated by a large desk covered in papers and files. Chief Markham, a bear of a man with salt and pepper hair, rose to greet Samuel as he entered. Sergeant Green, the chief said, extending a meaty hand. It's an honor to finally meet you. I've heard a lot about your work in the community. Samuel shook the offered hand, noting the chief's firm grip. The honor is mine, Chief Markham. And please, call me Samuel. I've been retired for quite some time now. The two men settled into their seats, a moment of silence stretching between them as they sized each other up. Finally, Chief Markham leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. Samuel, I'll cut straight to the chase. What you've accomplished with your community program is nothing short of remarkable. We've seen a significant drop in crime rates, especially among young offenders. But more than that, there's a sense of hope in the neighborhood that wasn't there before. Samuel nodded, a hint of pride in his eyes. It's not just me, Chief. It's the community coming together, people believing in second chances and working to make them a reality. Exactly, Markham said, a hint of excitement creeping into his voice. And that's why I want to expand this program. I believe what you've started could be replicated in other neighborhoods, maybe even other cities. Samuel leaned back in his chair, considering the chief's words. The idea was exciting, but he couldn't shake a nagging concern. It's an intriguing proposition, Chief. But I have to ask, how do you envision this expansion? The heart of our program is its personal touch, the connections we build with individuals. I'm not sure how that would translate to a larger scale. Chief Markham nodded, as if he had anticipated this question. That's where you come in, Samuel. We're not looking to create some faceless bureaucracy. We want you to train others, veterans, community leaders, anyone with the passion and commitment to make a difference. You've created a model that works. Now we want you to teach others how to implement it. As the chief continued to outline his vision, Samuel found his mind racing with possibilities. He thought of Jake, of Eddie, of Lisa, of all the lives that had been touched and transformed. The idea of extending that impact, of creating a network of support that could reach even more people in need, was undeniably appealing. But there were also challenges to consider. Chief, Samuel said, interrupting Markham's enthusiastic monologue, I appreciate your vision. I really do. But we need to be careful. Each community is unique, with its own set of challenges and dynamics. We can't just copy and paste what we've done here and expect it to work everywhere. Markham nodded, his expression serious. You're absolutely right, Samuel. That's why we need your expertise. You understand better than anyone that this isn't about imposing a one-size-fits-all solution. It's about teaching others to build programs that are tailored to their specific communities. As the conversation continued, Samuel found himself warming to the idea. They discussed potential pilot neighborhoods, funding sources, and the logistics of training new program leaders. By the time the meeting drew to a close, a tentative plan had begun to take shape. I'll need some time to think this over, Samuel said as he stood to leave, and I want to discuss it with the folks at the center. This isn't just my decision to make. Chief Markham nodded, understanding in his eyes. Of course. Take all the time you need. But Samuel, he added, his voice taking on a note of urgency, we have a real opportunity here to make a lasting difference. I hope you'll consider it seriously. As Samuel left the police station, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The chief's proposal offered the chance to expand his work, to touch even more lives. But it also meant stepping into unknown territory, taking on new responsibilities and challenges. Lost in thought, Samuel almost didn't notice the familiar figure waiting for him outside. It was Jake, pacing nervously on the sidewalk. Mr. Green, Jake called out, relief evident in his voice. I've been waiting for you. I need your advice. Samuel's brow furrowed with concern. What's wrong, Jake? Is everything all right? Jake ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Samuel had come to recognize as a sign of his anxiety. I got a job offer. It's entry-level, nothing fancy, but it's with a good company. They're willing to work around my GED classes and everything. That's wonderful news, Jake, Samuel said, genuine happiness in his voice. So what's the problem? Jake's eyes darted around, as if he was afraid someone might overhear. The job, it's in the same neighborhood where I used to hang out, where I did a lot of things I'm not proud of. Understanding dawned on Samuel's face. I see. You're worried about falling back in old habits? Jake nodded, his shoulders slumping. What if I run into my old crew? What if I'm not strong enough to resist the temptation? Samuel placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, his touch firm and reassuring. Jake, listen to me. The fact that you're even asking these questions shows how far you've come. The old Jake wouldn't have given it a second thought. As they walked together, Samuel continued, taking this job doesn't mean you have to face your past alone. We can work together to develop strategies for dealing with difficult situations. And remember, you have a whole community of support behind you now. Jake's posture began to relax, hope replacing the fear in his eyes. You really think I can do this, Mr. Green? Samuel smiled, a mix of pride and determination on his face. I know you can, Jake. But more importantly, you need to know it too. This job is an opportunity, a chance to rewrite your story in the very place where the old one began. As they parted ways, Jake with a newfound sense of purpose and Samuel with yet another reminder of the ongoing nature of his work, the sun was beginning to set. The city streets were bathed in a warm, golden light, as if nature itself was offering a sign of hope and renewal. Samuel's walk home was filled with contemplation. The chief's proposal, Jake's dilemma, the ongoing challenges and triumphs at the community center, all of it swirled in his mind, pieces of a puzzle he was still trying to solve. As he approached his house, Samuel noticed a figure sitting on his front porch. It was Eddie, his large frame hunched over, hands clasped between his knees. Eddie, Samuel called out, quickening his pace. Is everything all right? Eddie looked up, a mix of emotions playing across his face. Mr. Green, I need to talk to you before I leave. About the job, about everything. Samuel settled onto the porch step next to Eddie, the wood creaking slightly under their combined weight. I'm listening, son. What's on your mind? Eddie took a deep breath, as if steeling himself. I'm scared, Mr. Green. I'm scared of leaving, of starting over. But I'm also scared of staying, of falling back in old patterns. How do I know if I'm making the right choice? Samuel nodded, understanding in his eyes. Fear is a natural part of change, Eddie. It's okay to be scared. But let me ask you this. What scares you more? The uncertainty of a new start, or the certainty of what your life might become if you don't take this chance? Eddie fell silent, mulling over Samuel's words. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I want to be better, Mr. Green. I want to be the kind of man you believed I could be that night at the ATM. Samuel felt a surge of pride and affection for the young man beside him. Eddie, you're already on that path. Taking this job, facing your fears, that's what courage looks like. It's not about being fearless. It's about moving forward despite your fears. As they continued to talk, the street lamps flickered to life, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. Samuel shared stories from his own life, times when he had faced uncertainty and doubt, moments when he had to take leaps of faith. By the time Eddie stood to leave, his shoulders were straighter, his eyes clearer. Thank you, Mr. Green, he said, his voice thick with emotion. For everything. I don't know where I'd be without you in this program. Samuel stood as well, pulling Eddie into a brief, fierce hug. Remember, Eddie, you're not alone. Distance doesn't change that. You've got a whole community rooting for you, and we're just a phone call away if you need us. As Eddie's car pulled away, Samuel remained on the porch, watching until the taillights disappeared around a corner. He felt a familiar mix of pride and melancholy, the bittersweet feeling of watching someone take their first steps towards a new life. Inside his home, Samuel settled into his favorite armchair, his mind still buzzing with the events of the day. The chief's proposal, Jake's job opportunity, Eddie's imminent departure, all of it pointed to a program that was evolving, growing beyond its original scope. His eyes fell on the old photograph on the mantelpiece, the one of him in his military uniform. He smiled, thinking about how his mission had changed over the years, from protecting his country on foreign soil to nurturing hope on the streets of his own neighborhood. As he drifted off to sleep, Samuel's dreams were filled with visions of the future, of community centers opening their doors across the city, of lives being transformed, of a ripple effect spreading outward, touching countless lives in ways he could only imagine. The next morning dawned bright and clear, full of promise. Samuel rose early, his mind already racing with ideas. He had made his decision about the chief's proposal, but before he could move forward, He needed to discuss it with the people who mattered most, the community he had built around the center. As he walked to the community center, Samuel noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood that he hadn't seen before. The street seemed cleaner, windows that had once been boarded up now displayed open for business signs, and there was a general air of renewal that seemed to permeate the area. At the center, he found a small crowd already gathered. News of the chief's proposal had spread, and people were eager to hear what Samuel had to say. As he looked around the room, he saw familiar faces. Jake, nervously fidgeting in his seat. Lisa, the newcomer from yesterday, looking more at ease. Mrs. Thompson, beaming with pride, and many others whose lives had been touched by the program. Samuel cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. "Good morning, everyone. I'm sure you've all heard rumors about a meeting I had with the police chief yesterday. Well, I'm here to set the record straight and to get your input on a decision that will affect all of us." He went on to explain the chief's proposal in detail, the idea of expanding the program to other neighborhoods, of training new leaders to implement similar initiatives across the city. As he spoke, he could see a mix of emotions on the faces before him: excitement, apprehension, curiosity. "Now, I want to be clear," Samuel continued, his voice firm. "This isn't just my decision to make. What we've built here, we've built together. Your voices matter in this. So before I give the chief my answer, I want to hear from you." For the next hour, the room buzzed with discussion. People shared their thoughts, their hopes, and their concerns. Jake spoke about the opportunity to help others who were struggling like he once had. Lisa, despite being new, expressed her belief that more people needed access to programs like this. Mrs. Thompson worried about losing the personal touch that made their community special. As Samuel listened, he felt a growing sense of certainty. The passion and commitment in the room were palpable. These weren't just program participants. They were a community, a family bound together by shared experiences and a common goal. Finally, as the discussion began to wind down, Samuel stood once more. "Thank you all for your honesty and your insights. After hearing from all of you, and after much thought, I've made my decision." The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on Samuel. "I'm going to accept the chief's proposal," he said, his voice clear and resolute. "But with conditions. We won't be creating carbon copies of this center. Instead, we'll be training others to build programs tailored to their own communities. And we'll be doing it together." He looked around the room, meeting each person's gaze. "This isn't the end of what we've built here. It's a new beginning. We have an opportunity to take what we've learned, the bonds we've forged, and use them to help even more people. But I can't do it alone. I'll need all of you to be part of this next chapter." As Samuel's words sank in, a wave of excitement swept through the room. People began to talk animatedly, already brainstorming ideas for how they could contribute to the expansion. Jake approached Samuel, a look of determination on his face. "Mr. Green, I want to help. Maybe I could share my story with other young people who are where I was." Samuel smiled, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder. "That's exactly the kind of involvement we'll need, Jake. Your experience, your journey, that's powerful stuff." As the meeting broke up and people began to file out, energized by the prospect of this new chapter, Samuel found himself overwhelmed with emotion. This was more than he could have ever imagined when he confronted Jake and Eddie that night at the ATM. It was a testament to the power of second chances, of community, of never giving up on people. Later that day, as Samuel sat in Chief Markham's office, outlining his vision for the program's expansion, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about reducing crime rates or cleaning up neighborhoods. It was about changing lives one person at a time and creating a ripple effect of hope and transformation that could spread far beyond their city limits. As the sun set on another day, Samuel stood outside the community center, watching as the last few stragglers headed home. He thought about Jake about to start his new job, about Eddie embarking on a new life in a new state, about Lisa taking her first tentative steps towards a better future. He thought about all the lives yet to be touched, all the stories yet to be rewritten. And he knew, with a certainty that filled him with both excitement and humility, that his work was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The street lamps flickered to life, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. Samuel took a deep breath, savoring the moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new lives to touch. But for now, he allowed himself to simply be present, grateful for the journey that had brought him here and excited for the road ahead. As he turned to lock up the center, Samuel's eyes fell on a small plaque beside the door, one that had been installed just a few weeks ago. It bore a simple message, one that had become the unofficial motto of their community. "It's never too late to change your path." Samuel smiled, running his fingers over the engraved words. Yes, he thought, it's never too late. And sometimes, changing your own path means helping others find theirs. With a final look at the quiet street, Samuel headed home, his heart full and his mind already turning to the work that lay ahead. The ripple effect had begun, and there was no telling how far it might spread. The story of Samuel Green, the retired sergeant who had become an unexpected mentor and community leader, was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning to unfold, touching lives and transforming communities in ways that even Samuel himself could not yet imagine. As he walked home under the starlit sky, Samuel felt a profound sense of gratitude and purpose. He had found his true calling, not on distant battlefields, but right here in the heart of his own community. And with each life touched, each story rewritten, the ripples of hope and change continued to spread, promising a brighter future for all. If Samuel's journey resonated with you, let us know in the comments below. We hope his story reminds you that even in the face of danger and adversity, courage, resilience, and compassion can create powerful change. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one.